telling this tale isn't easy for me. You see, as a Navy person, folks think I should be tough, like a big sturdy ship on the ocean waves. When you think of the military, what comes to mind? Maybe you picture strong soldiers in uniform, standing tall and proud. That's what those TV ads want you to see, right? They want you to think the military is rock solid and that you could be just as strong. But here's the thing. There's something that happened to me that still rattles me to this day. I was stationed in Cadiz, a beautiful place with serene views and calm seas, and most of the time people like me come and go from that base without experiencing anything out of the ordinary. I wasn't very fortunate. What I saw changed everything for me, and it messed up my whole career, but let's not rush into things. It happened on a late night. I was by the beach, looking out at the shallow cliffs that met the sea with jagged rocks. I loved being by the beach. Many of us sailors would go there to enjoy the peaceful scenery. That night I planned to do just that. But then, out of nowhere, the screaming began. At first it wasn't clear what was happening. I could hear shouts and cries coming from the busier part of town. I saw some lights flashing and dark shapes moving around. A bunch of folks were out searching for someone, and I felt like I needed to lend a hand. I began walking towards them, just a few narrow alleys away, but something held me back. Then, another scream pierced the night, but it was different from the others. This one was sharp and full of pain. It sounded like it came from the direction of the cliff, but nobody else seemed to notice that the scream was too far away from the group gathered nearby. There were too many buildings and too much space in between. I could join the group and help them, sure, but then who would check out the scream? I hurried towards the cliff. The evening was getting darker, making it hard to see, but I managed to spot a shape on the ledge. It was a person. There, on the edge of the cliff, stood someone. I could see their shoulders and legs. I called out to them. Then I noticed something strange. There was movement behind the person. Something was hiding right in line with the person's body. Slowly, I saw arms emerge from the hidden thing. They reached out and wrapped around the person on the cliff. It looked like the arms of snakes in the dim light. The person I was rushing to help looked terrified. Their mouth twisted in fear, like they wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. The arms around them squeezed tight, making it hard for them to breathe. Then, slowly, the head of the hidden thing emerged. It wasn't quite like a person's head. It was long and stretched, not quite right. Something about it reminded me of an eel. The thing was scary, and it seemed to hate me and the person it held tight. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind me, and I felt relieved that someone had noticed me. The flashlights from town moved towards me. The creature got startled and quickly leaped off the cliff, dragging the person with it. They both vanished into the darkness. I stood there, shocked, as the crowd rushed past me. They were yelling, wondering why I hadn't stopped the person from jumping, but I knew it wasn't a big fall. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't know the truth. Only I knew that the person hadn't just fallen, but they had been pulled, taken. After a while, I reached the edge of the cliff, standing alongside the search group. I couldn't recall walking there, but I found myself gazing down, but there was nobody. No person, no body, and definitely no monster. Some of the others had gone down to search below. We all saw the person fall. The sea wasn't rough enough to have swept them away so quickly. Then I heard shouts from below. "Eels! Eels in the water!" As far as I knew, the eels in the water wouldn't have been dangerous, but the locals seemed to know something I didn't. They rushed out of the water as fast as they could. I followed them for a while. They were going to report to the police, who oddly hadn't joined the search earlier. I felt like I needed to confirm what happened. I wanted to share what I saw about the strange creature wrapped around the person, but I never got the chance. The police didn't want to listen to me or the others. They didn't seem interested in helping at all. I expected there to be a big commotion. I thought the locals would be really mad, but one by one I saw their hope fade when the police turned them away. It seemed like they knew something I didn't. Like they had the answers to the puzzle that I was still figuring out. I tried to get them to talk, to tell me what happened, but they kept me in the dark too. I wondered if it was a secret plan among the locals. Maybe the person had done something wrong, and the community thought it was okay to let the sea take them. I never found out why the person went to the cliff or why the town was searching for them. When I told my friends, they just laughed. People said that Cadiz had secrets, but that didn't make me feel any better. It didn't stop me from feeling uneasy. And then, when I couldn't go on without knowing the truth, the Navy let me go. It felt like I was pushed off my own cliff. Now I'm just waiting and hoping that one day, someone will come and explain what I saw that day. When this happened, it totally changed how I saw the wild outdoors, and I realized there was so much out there that I hadn't known about before. This story goes back to when I was around 13 or 14 years old. I used to live in Ohio, and every summer my parents would send me to a camp in the eastern part of the state for a whole week. It was one of those camps where you stay overnight, and it was all about outdoor adventures. Think hiking, archery, group games, campfires with songs, and all the fun stuff you could imagine for a summer camp. The place had different kinds of accommodations. For the older kids, there were log cabins, which were cozy and cool. Then there were these things called yurts, which were like big tents shaped like a teepee. In addition to log cabins and yurts, there were also tree houses, and that's where I got to stay. The tree house was like a single-room house, lifted about 10 feet above the ground by wooden supports, sort of like stilts. It wasn't like a regular room because it didn't have solid walls all around, but instead there was just a short barrier, about 3 feet high, to keep us safe inside. This meant we could feel the breeze and hear the sounds of the forest all around us. But we weren't left completely exposed to the weather. The treehouse had a slanted roof made of wood, with parts that stuck out over the edges to keep the rain off us. And because each living area was quite far from the others, it felt like we were deep in the woods. Our little group had a counselor looking after us and about 6 kids altogether. I always had a bit of trouble sleeping, especially on the last night of camp because the moon was shining so brightly it felt like daytime. The night was calm, except for the usual forest sounds you'd hear on a summer night. I lay there, lost in my own thoughts. But then I noticed a sound. It was different from the usual noises, but at first it was just a soft rustle of leaves, but it was getting closer, and the sound was getting clearer. I listened carefully, feeling a bit nervous now. Whatever it was, it seemed to be coming closer to our treehouse. The sound was like someone walking through the trees. It wasn't like the footsteps of an animal. It sounded more like a person walking. And it sounded really close now. At that moment, I noticed the sound was coming from the south, which was deeper into the woods and towards the lake, not from the north where the outhouse and kitchen were. That made me think it wasn't a counselor or someone coming to tell us something. When I realized that, my curiosity turned into fear. I knew whatever it was, it would soon reach the clearing around our treehouse. I tried to move quietly so I could sit up and peek over the railing. As I sat up, I heard a faint rustling to my left. The other kids were still sleeping, but I saw our counselor, who was sleeping in the treehouse with us, was awake. It turned out our counselor had noticed me getting up and gestured for me to stay put when he saw me. He was lying down, but he raised his hand to signal me to stop as soon as our eyes met. I followed his instructions and lay back down. I held my breath and listened carefully. The footsteps had stopped, which made me even more anxious because I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. I was afraid it might be right beneath us in the clearing around the treehouse. Then, I heard a branch snap and a strange flapping sound. The counselor quietly got up from his cot, and I couldn't resist following him. When we peered through the railing, we witnessed a strange sight. A creature swooped down from a tree and landed on the ground below us, and it was like nothing I had ever seen or heard of before. This creature was tall and dark, with wings spread wide. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness. The counselor and I were frozen in place, staring in disbelief. As we watched, the creature glanced up, and its gaze locked with mine. It felt like it was specifically looking at me. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the creature had been searching for me. The creature remained still, its intense gaze piercing through us, as if it could see right into our souls. The silence around us was so thick it felt like we couldn't even hear ourselves breathe. We waited, barely moving, wondering what the strange creature would do next. Suddenly it spread its wings and flew up into the trees, disappearing into the darkness above. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do next. We stayed huddled in the treehouse for the rest of the night, afraid to move. There was no way we were going to leave, not knowing where that creature had gone. We also didn't want to wake up the others and cause a big commotion. Thankfully, it wasn't too long until sunrise. When the light started to creep in and everyone woke up, the counselor calmly gathered us all and led us to the main camp area, where we could feel safer. He ordered us to stay put while he went and talked to the camp director. The other kids didn't know what was going on, and I just did not want to talk about it at all. There was such a weird mood in the camp that morning while we waited for our parents to pick us up. It was a complete contrast to the usual last day shenanigans that would usually be going on. I don't know what the counselors told the parents. I did tell my mom and dad what I had seen. It's hard to know what they really thought. From that day on, I never looked at the woods in the same way again. I had experienced something that hardly anyone would believe, and it really changed me. A few Christmases ago, something really memorable happened when we moved back to Lake Superior to be closer to Mom. She was sick with cancer, which made things tough. My sister and her husband stayed in a rental nearby, but my little brother and I slept at Mom's house. Christmas was coming, but it didn't feel very festive because Mom was really sick. My brother-in-law was trying hard to make things better. He did fun things to cheer us up. Mom liked him a lot, and it made me like him more too. On Christmas Eve, my brother-in-law had an idea. He suggested we all go for a hike in the woods. Mom and my sister were happy to stay home, and they convinced my little brother to stay with them too. So, just my brother-in-law and I went hiking. My brother-in-law and I set off together, driving in his truck to the start of our hike. The weather that day was pretty scary. The sky was gray and heavy, and the ground was covered in ice. Despite the gloomy weather, we tried to keep the mood light by chatting a bit in the truck. As we drove along the icy road, I secretly hoped my brother-in-law would get a bit nervous or do something silly to break the tension, but he stayed calm and collected the whole time, which made me admire him even more. Finally, we arrived at the trailhead and parked the truck in an empty lot. We grabbed our backpacks and made sure we were bundled up warmly before setting off on our hike. For a while, we walked in silence, just enjoying the snowy wilderness around us. The trees were covered in frost and the air was crisp and cold. Then, as we continued, tiny snowflakes started to fall from the sky, covering the trail in a soft blanket of white. It was beautiful, but it also made it hard to see where we were going. Still, we pressed on, following the general direction of the trail as best as we could. After we'd been walking through the snow for about half an hour, I started to feel a bit annoyed. I couldn't quite explain it, but there was this strange feeling in my gut about my brother-in-law. It was like something didn't feel right, but I pushed the thought aside and kept trudging through the snow behind him. Then all of a sudden, he stopped so suddenly that I almost bumped into him. But as I came to a halt behind him, a horrible smell hit my nose like a punch. It was a smell like no other, something rotting and foul. It was so strong that it made my stomach turn. I figured it must be a dead animal nearby, maybe a moose that had gotten trapped and died, but the smell was so overpowering, it felt like there had to be more than just one dead moose. It was like the smell of death itself had seeped into the air around us. I suggested that the smell was probably from a dead animal, still looking at the back of my brother-in-law's head. I didn't want to see his face because if he looked like he was going to throw up, I might feel sick too. "It's coming from over there," he said in a strange, robotic voice. Then, without even turning to look at me, he stepped off the trail we had been following. He started walking into the thick trees on our right as if he was on autopilot. I called out to him, but he just kept walking towards something. I had to make a decision. Should I stay there alone in the stinky air and wait for him to come back, or should I follow him? I really didn't want to be alone out there in the wilderness. When I finally decided to follow him, he was already quite far ahead, and we were no longer on the trail. Since it was snowing heavily, I couldn't just reach out and grab him to make him stop. Whatever he was going towards seemed really bad. I could smell it, but it was more than that. I could feel it too. As we walked, the smell got even worse. It was like we had stumbled into a place where all the dead animals in the world had been left to rot, but it was even worse than that. Then a loud noise echoed from deeper in the woods where the awful smell was coming from. My brother-in-law started walking faster, and soon he was way ahead of me. I couldn't see him anymore. I felt so scared being alone out there. The snow was falling heavily now, and I couldn't help but wonder why I had ever agreed to go hiking in the middle of winter with this strange guy. At first, I thought it was an animal. Its legs looked like those of a deer, with hooves all snowy and unkempt. But when I looked up, I couldn't even scream. The creature had the body of a deer, but its abdomen and rib cage were human-like and horribly skinny. Its skin was torn and stretched, with bits of flesh hanging off. And at about 7 feet tall, its head was skinless and staring right at me with glowing yellow eyes. It stood about 10 feet away from me, towering over the snow. I watched in horror as its lips curled into a wicked grin, showing off teeth as sharp as nails and a tongue as black as night. The awful smell around us grew even stronger as it started moving towards me. I was frozen with fear, not knowing what to do, but then out of nowhere my brother-in-law appeared with a flare. He threw it straight at the creature like a pro, and it hit the monster's bony chest before landing in the snow between us. As the flare's light grew brighter, the monster let out a piercing screech and arched its back in pain. Its eyes seemed to be filled with pure evil as it turned and ran off into the wilderness, away from us. It was a moment I still can't believe happened. My brother and I didn't need to say a word. We both understood that we had to leave that place quickly. We sprinted back to the car, feeling thankful that we hadn't been harmed. Even now, we're unsure if what we witnessed was real or just a trick of our minds due to the freezing cold. But one thing is certain, whatever that creature was in the woods, it was unlike anything I've ever encountered. Its presence exuded a darkness that surpassed even the cruelty of cancer. In Atlanta, Georgia, where I work as a janitor at a high school, there's a small graveyard across the street. At first I thought it looked pretty old, but I never bothered to go look at the gravestones until I had a reason to. Let me tell you why. I started working there a few months ago, and for the first month it was a normal job. I come in around 3 after school's done for the day, and clean until 8 or so, whenever I finish up. It's pretty boring, as you can imagine, so I usually listen to podcasts or music, whatever I'm in the mood for. One evening, as things started to get strange, I was listening to a mystery podcast, probably because it was around Halloween. So I'm listening to this mysterious story, and I turn around with my mop in my hand and trip over this white cat. We get a lot of stray cats around here since the winters are so mild, but I hardly ever see a white cat, especially one like this that was all white. It was long-haired and well-fed. Looked like a pet, not a stray. I thought it was probably just visiting, wandering around or whatever, and it would go home soon. When I left, it walked out and down the street, cool as you please, toward the graveyard. It disappeared into the graveyard, but I was sure it couldn't live there. I thought it must have gone to one of the houses behind it since it did look well cared for. I didn't expect to see it again, but it showed up again the next night and trailed me for my whole shift. Now, I thought it had to be lost or a stray. I took a picture of it and put it up on the lost animal social media pages, just in case. When I went out to my truck to go home, it went off toward the graveyard again. The day after that, I brought a can of cat food with me, and when the cat showed up, I opened the can and put it in front of it. The cat just walked away from it. I thought maybe it didn't like the food, so I brought some tuna next time. Every cat likes tuna. Not this one. I still didn't think there was anything strange about the cat, though. I hadn't figured out what was going on. No, I just thought someone else must be feeding it. But if that was true, then why was it hanging around? Sure, it was a little chilly outside, especially at night, but if it was cold, why did it always leave when I did? Maybe I thought it wanted attention. So I decided I'd try to pet it, but every time I reached down, it managed to sidestep and avoid my hand. I kept trying though, and finally, I got it cornered. It wasn't scared like it didn't hiss or anything, but it gave me a look, as if it was saying, "Do you really want to do this?" And I reached for it, but my hand went right through. I couldn't believe it. I reached out again and it sidestepped. That was when I had the thought, this is not a real cat. Okay, so what was it? And what did it want? I felt like it wanted something because it kept coming around and following me. Not food, not attention. So what? I felt like it was trying to tell me something. Every night it walked back toward the graveyard. So one night I followed it, but when I got to the graveyard, it walked behind one of the stones and was gone. Since I was already there, I started to look at the stones. They were kind of messed up, dirty and so on, but it was dark, so I couldn't really read them. I looked around, trying to figure out where that cat could have gone. There are a couple of houses past the cemetery. I guessed it must have gone to one of them. I tried not to think about the fact that it looked like it had just disappeared. I couldn't help it, though. I kept thinking about that cemetery. Finally, one Saturday, I decided to clean it up. I loaded up the truck with everything I thought I'd need. Weed trimmer, bleach, cloths, a pressure washer. I'd never cleaned gravestones before, but I cleaned everything else, so I figured I could handle it. I wasn't out there 10 minutes before people started showing up to help. One lady even brought flowers to put on the graves when we were done. I asked a few people if they knew anyone who'd lost a white cat. No one did, but a couple of people said they'd seen one hanging around the graveyard. Never during the day, though, only at night. When we were done, the place looked great. Before we left, I took a look at the stone the cat had disappeared behind. The name didn't mean anything to me, but an old guy behind me said, I knew him. He was a janitor at the school. I saw that he'd died in 1955, age 72. On Monday, the cat didn't show up. I kind of missed it as I cleaned. I mean, it never did anything except follow me around while I worked, but still, it was some kind of company. I found myself looking for it every time I finished cleaning one room and started another. When it was time to leave, I stood outside for a minute, looking toward the graveyard. Finally, I saw the cat walking toward me. It didn't come all the way, just up to the sidewalk. It meowed, the first time I ever heard it do that. Then it went back to the graveyard. I never saw it again, but once every few months I go over to the graveyard and clean off those stones. You know, I think that's all it wanted me to do. Back in the early 2000s, not long after 9/11, something really strange happened to me. It was extra scary because at that time, we were all very sensitive about things happening in the sky. I was hanging out with someone I was dating, who is now my ex. We wanted to get away from the city for a bit, so we packed up some snacks and drinks and drove to this deserted beach on the Gulf of Mexico. We parked our truck facing the water, like we'd done before. We had blankets and pillows with us, and sometimes we'd stay out there all night. It was late at night and the sky was super dark with lots of stars. There wasn't even a moon, but the stars were so bright and beautiful. We were sitting in the back of the truck, chatting and munching on snacks. Eventually, we both got quiet and lost in our own thoughts. After a while, I realized my ex had fallen asleep. I was still awake, watching the lights on the offshore drilling platforms in the distance. That's when I noticed two red lights up high, moving slowly across the sky. One was above the other. They came down lower and stopped, and then the top light started moving on its own. It was doing these really sharp turns, not like any airplane I'd ever seen. I didn't know what to think, or maybe it was something from the military. But then the other light split apart, and I saw 6 bluish-purple lights form an arch. I woke up my ex, and we both watched as the light started moving lower, towards the water, but also closer to us. We started feeling a bit scared. The lights kept moving in this arch pattern, and the one that had been moving around like crazy started coming towards us, picking up speed before suddenly stopping. The other lights formed a line behind it. It was like the first one was checking things out for the rest. Then it started zigzagging across the sky, going really fast without slowing down. It was definitely not something a human could do. We were both amazed and terrified. We got out of the truck and just stared up at them. It was silent, except for the sound of our own breathing. Then the lights started blinking rapidly as they got closer and lower. Without saying anything, we both knew we had to get back in the truck and leave. As we drove away, we were trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Then we heard this strange noise, like feedback from a speaker, getting louder and louder. I looked up through the moonroof and saw the lights right above us, the noise almost deafening. We were panicking, thinking they were after us. The noise didn't sound like engines. It was like something electronic. They passed overhead and we thought it was over, but then this blinding light appeared right above us. We were frozen with shock. The light hovered for a minute before slowly moving away, splitting into two and then disappearing completely. And just like that, it was over. But we were on edge for a long time, worried it might come back.